Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is again David Parnell, who last time he was talking about the career of the remarkable Belisarius and Antonina, and in the last episode we took the story up to Belisarius's triumph, his triumphant capture of the old Roman province of Africa, his return to Constantinople, leading the Vandal king Gelimer in triumph, and then depositing both the king and prostrating himself alongside the king in front of Justinian in just a massive triumph of the Roman people. So that's where we were last time, David. I think I've got that about right.
Yes, that's an excellent recap.
So Justinian, he's had this great idea to make the Roman Empire great again, by recapturing Africa. So it's gone so well. He then launches part two of his campaign, which is to retake Roman Italy. But just before we get on to that, I just wanted to talk a bit about the sources, because our main source, and I don't know if he's our only source, but our main source is Procopius, who Belisarius, I think he's actually in Belisarius's entourage as his legal advisor. And that's fantastic because the man is an eyewitness to most of the events. He's right there. But there's a problem because Procopius writes two books, and one of which is a sober and fantastic history of the wars. And then in the second one, he basically says, don't pay any attention to the first book. Here's the real story. So is this unique in historical writing, and what should we make of it, and what should we make of Procopius?
This is a $1 million question, as we might say, and it's the source of quite a bit of contention. Procopius is this fascinating and well-placed historian. He served with Belisarius for at least 13 years, traveling with him from what is Mesopotamia all the way to Italy, to North Africa, and everything in between. So he's an eyewitness for many of these things. And the wars, he writes very clearly, for public consumption, including consumption by the principal characters. So we can imagine that if Justinian and Theodora and Belisarius and Antonina didn't sit down and read it personally, they were having it read to them while they were doing activity or something. So this is written under the assumption that these principal figures will read it or will hear it read to them, and therefore it is written to be acceptable to them. The secret history is written for an entirely different purpose and is clearly not intended to be read by principal figures, and perhaps not to be read at all in their lifetimes. So it's not clear exactly when Procopius imagines the secret history might be read. There is the possibility that he wrote it entirely for posterity, and so it was intended to be read after everybody of this generation was dead, and they discover the papers in his study or something, and produce it. It's also possible, and has been argued, that Procopius wrote the secret history in preparation for a potential coup against Justinian, and that if a new regime came to power, the first thing that regime would do would be to clear out all of Justinian's followers and entourage, which would include the general Belisarius, which would then include Procopius, Belisarius's legal advisor. And so in this sense, the secret history is written as insurance by Procopius, so that if there is a regime change, he can hold up this document and say, look, I was not a crony of the Justinian regime. Here's my criticism of the emperor. And it'd be almost like a get out of jail card for him if there was such a regime change. So this is very unusual, and we struggle with this information. In fact, some historians many, many years ago even thought that there's no way it was the same author who wrote both of these texts. Almost all modern historians of Procopius believe he did write both texts, but there is some disagreement about why he wrote both texts and how truthful each one is, with some believing that the secret history is his true feelings, while the the wars. It's just what he had to write for public consumption. And others arguing that the secret history is deliberately over the top and invective in the sense that we can't trust it as real history. Which is exactly the case is subject to debate.
Okay, you say it's subject to debate. Didn't read the whole of the Secret Histories, but reading the bits that you quoted, I was just struck that it just seemed, so much of it seems psychologically implausible. This idea that Antonina is, completely dominating this sort of love-struck Belisarius who basically does whatever she tells him. It just didn't strike me as the way, relationships between highly intelligent, successful people work. What's your feeling about where the truth lies between the two?
Yes, this is an argument that I make at some length in the book over the course of several different chapters because it's so critical to our understanding of Belisarius and Antonina and what their relationship was. I do believe that the portrayal of their marriage in the secret history is unlikely to be real. It is, as you say, extremely implausible and over the top. And more than that, it's crafted in such a way as to completely smear both of their characters at the same time. The secret history portrays Antonina as this sex-crazed woman who completely dominates all the men around her and is also ruthless and violent to a pathological extent, while it portrays Belisarius as completely emasculated, subservient to his wife's demands, completely unable to stand up for himself or his friends. And this so successfully makes them both look bad at the same time that it's hard to treat it as real. Because if you wanted to create a story that made them both look bad, you couldn't come up with anything better than this. Like, this is the pinnacle of what we would today call a smear campaign. And that makes it suspect as far as its truthfulness, I believe.
And she's accused, I think, of having an adulterous affair. Is it with her own son, or did I get that wrong? But she's accused of this affair, and you think, I can just about believe an affair which took place, say, in Constantinople while the husband's away. But you're right there, on campaign. The idea that this can be carried on secretly, it just seems to me to be absurd.
The affair she's accused of is not just any old affair. It's not like she finds some dashing army officer to have an affair with while her husband's busy. It is her teenage adopted son. And the Romans took adoption very seriously. So this adoption would have made Theodosius, this young man, their son, in a legal and moral sense. And he is described as this young man without his first beard. So he's a young teenager. So this affair is not only incestuous, it's also pedophilic because of the age of this young man, young boy. Many modern historians have looked at that story and said, yep, that must be what happened, because Procopius said that's what happened. And, this strikes me as being entirely too credulous, too trusting of the story that we're being given, and what is clearly a text written to make Antonina and Belisarius look bad. You would of course expect it to be something terrible, but you would not necessarily imagine that it had to be the truth.
Yeah, the thing I always compare it to is Suetonius writing nonsense about Tiberius's depraved orgies on the island of Capri, this man in his 70s with a liking for philosophy. But I suppose the difference with Suetonius is that he's not there. He can make it up, as much as he likes, and nobody was there, so you can say what you like. But the only thing going for Procopius is that he actually was there, but I still think it's nonsense.
Yeah, Procopius was there, so we give him that. But then we start trying to sort of pull the threads of the story a little bit, and we see that there's a lot missing. So he reports these instances of this affair going on, and there's almost never any witnesses described to these events. The affair is not described in any other source that has survived from this world. Not a single source breathes any rumor of any of this kind of stuff or suggests that any kind of thing like this is going on. And it's just hard to imagine that if this was happening on campaign with soldiers and officers all around, that literally nobody else would have noticed it. But somehow the historian, was privy to what's going on in the bedroom and knew this was happening. It stretches the imagination.
Okay, well, look, let's get back to the action. Justinian, he's got this great idea. Let's take back Italy. And unlike Africa, he doesn't send a huge army. And this is what I can't understand, is the size of the army he sends with Belisarius.
This is something that I find very interesting as well. So we have an account from Procopius of the size of this army. So we know exactly how many people were sent. There were 7,500 regular soldiers in this force, plus an unknown number of private guardsmen of Belisarius and his upper echelon of officers. So even if those were fairly sizable, we might be talking about 9,000 or so in this army. So this is about at least half the size of the force sent to fight Gelimer and the Vandals in North Africa. So clearly we have a smaller force sent here. So the question is why? Has Justinian lost his mind with sort of arrogance and glee, and believes that this force can defeat all of the Ostrogoths? And the argument that I make is that no, Justinian is not foolish here, nor is he gambling. What Justinian is doing is acting on intelligence from his diplomatic efforts. So the situation in the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy is very unsettled at this point. The founding king, Theodoric, has been dead now for a number of years. And when he died, he left his power to his grandson. And his grandson was too young. So his daughter, the grandson's mother, Amalasuntha, took power as regent for her young son in the Ostrogothic kingdom. So far, well and good. But Amalasuntha's position weakened dramatically when her son died, still young. So now Amalasuntha is trying to rule the Ostrogothic kingdom as queen regnant in a society that does not look kindly on women rulers. So she's casting about for an idea to keep herself in power and to avoid being thrown from the top and eaten by the wolves. And so Amalasuntha reaches out to her cousin, Theodahad, and raises him up and associates him with her in power. But this is a tenuous agreement. She can't marry him. He's her cousin. And so he can never be king to her queen in that sort of marital sense. So they're uneasily sharing power. And as far as we can tell from Procopius, Amalasuntha recognizes the awkwardness of her position and reaches out to Justinian and promises that if Justinian will grant her estates in his empire and a comfortable position and a high rank, then she will turn over Italy to him and his forces, and she will retire happily to these estates. So the emperor, and we might say the emperor is naive if he believes this is actually going to happen, but I believe that Justinian thought that these diplomatic efforts over the course of, I've compressed this all, probably many years, are bearing fruit. And so the force that he sends with Belisarius is not intended to outright conquer the Ostrogothic kingdom and take all of Italy by force. It is a force that is intentionally sized to liberate and occupy and restore authority in a territory that has been ceded to it by a foreign government. Justinian believes that first Amalasuntha, and later, once she's killed, Theodahad, will cede Italy to Belisarius and his forces. And this does not come to pass, and that's why we end up with a lengthy war. But I think the emperor believed that this was a possibility. And if that truly did happen, then the size of Belisarius' army would have been reasonable for the kind of thing that it would have been called upon to do. Because this doesn't happen, because Theodahad at the last minute, apparently the last minute, changes his mind, withdraws his offer, and imprisons Justinian's diplomatic representatives, then there is no choice but to order Belisarius to invade, and the emperor, realizing the army is too small, will send gradually dribble out reinforcements to Belisarius over the next few years.
What happened to poor old Amalthusas?
Poor old Amalasuntha.
What happened to poor old what happened to the poor old queen?
Amalasuntha, in her power-sharing agreement with Theodahad, ended up with the short end of the stick, being the woman in the pair, being less popular amongst the Gothic nobility, it would appear. Amalasuntha was first imprisoned by Theodahad and then strangled to death in her prison cell, thus ending the life of the queen and the direct line of succession from Theodoric, the founder of the Ostrogothic kingdom. So Amalasuntha is dead. Theodahad is the sole king, but he seems to be a character who is not as ruthless as his murder of his cousin might imply, and he waffles on whether he can actually control this beast that is the Ostrogothic kingdom. And so he does seem to think for a while that he might take Amalasuntha's offer from Justinian for himself and agree to cede the kingdom of Italy if he can retire comfortably with wealth and honor. But then, as I said, changes his mind at the last minute, and that proves to be a poor choice for him and for Italy.
And is that because the Romans they're trying to push their way up through the Balkans, I think, and then there's a battle which they win, but the general's killed, and it all just goes a bit badly for the Romans, and suddenly they start to look a bit weaker than perhaps everybody had been thinking.
Yes. So concurrent with this diplomatic push, Justinian is making military maneuvers to pressure Theodahad. So there is a Roman army operating in the Balkans where the Ostrogoths have an outpost near Salona. And then Belisarius and his army arrives in Sicily, which at this point is still a territory of the Ostrogothic kingdom. And Belisarius and his army have this great success, sweep through Sicily, no problem, turn it all over to Roman authority. And so at the close of 535, we're in a situation where it's looking good for the Romans. And then early in 536, there's several things that go wrong at once. Belisarius faces a mutiny amongst his soldiers in Sicily. The Roman army in the Balkans wins a battle, but loses their general while doing so, the same general Mundus who had been at the Nika riots with Belisarius. So the Romans are in disarray there. And this seems to embolden Theodahad to say, I'm not going to give up my throne. You Romans are no threat to me. And so then Justinian has no choice, at least he sees it as having no choice, but to then order the invasion of Italy.
And so I'd like to say it goes well for the Romans. It sort of does, in the sense that Belisarius, he's able to push up. I think he takes Naples by some sort of, I wouldn't say a subterfuge exactly, but he smuggles people in through the aqueduct, I think. And so he's taken the south, and he's able to occupy Rome. But he's got far too few people for the task of subduing the entire peninsula, hasn't he?
Yeah, so this is the difficulty of the first portion of Belisarius's campaign in Italy in 535 to 540 is how long this campaign lasts. So worth noticing here the difference with the Vandal campaign, which was over in 6 months. The Italy campaign goes on for 5 years, and that's only the first portion of it. We haven't even got to the longer history.
We may have to telescope it a bit, or whatever the word is.
But yeah, so Belisarius does not have the kind of army he needs to fight a drawn-out campaign against a determined foe in Italy. And that's what he faces. The Ostrogoths very quickly realize Theodahad does not have the gumption for this war, overthrow him, kill him, and replace him with a new king, Vitiges, who carries on the war vigorously, if not terribly effectively. And Belisarius, who by and large seems to be welcomed by the people of Italy as a hero, he faces almost no opposition, with the exception of the city of Naples that you mentioned. Belisarius marches straight through southern Italy, central Italy, enters Rome unopposed. But yes, at this point, realizes that an army of his size is not sufficient for waging this war. He's dissipated the army along the way. He's left garrisons in Sicily, at Naples, and now he wants to leave a garrison at Rome. But if he does all that and moves forward, he won't have the army he needs. So Belisarius ends up bottled up in Rome, waiting for Justinian to catch up on the situation and send him reinforcements.
They're bottled up in Rome, and they have the company of the then Pope, which is Pope Silverius. Is that right?
Yes.
And it turns out that Silverius is busy trying to hand over the keys to the city to the Ostrogoths. At least that's what we're led to believe. And it seems this is an extraordinary scene where Antonina sort of leads the charge against the Pope and has him dismissed. Is that mainly from the secret history? Does it come from other sources? What's going on?
We have actually a lot of sources for the deposition of Pope Silverius, which makes it one of those lovely and rare anecdotes of ancient history, which is well attested in multiple ways. So it's attested by Procopius in both the history of the wars and the secret history, but it's also mentioned in other Eastern sources. It's also mentioned in Italian sources, including by the Book of the Popes, which is kept by the Catholic Church itself there in Rome. So we've got a lot of evidence for this happening, and each of them portrays the event in a slightly different way. But the combined effect of all these sources is that they all agree that in some way both Belisarius and Antonina are involved in the deposition of Pope Silverius. And that, I think, makes this completely unique and remarkable in not just the history of late antiquity, but the history of the papacy in general. There have been instances before of a pope being deposed by an emperor, and there will be again in the future. But never before has a Roman general and his wife sort of tag teamed the deposition of a pope. So that Antonina is this heavily involved is completely exceptional. And I think it's an episode that doesn't get enough attention in modern histories of the period, who tend to, briefly pass through this or ignore it entirely. And I think it's worth thinking about that Antonina and her husband are involved in this. It shows the way that the pair of them work together and the unity of purpose they have.
And what is the papacy at this time? Because I guess we're kind of conditioned into thinking of the papacy in terms of, the middle papacy, where it's this powerful semi-secular power, gold and jewels dripping. But at this stage, how prestigious is the papacy?
At this time, the Pope has quite a lot of religious prestige. So we've already entered a period where the Pope claims quite a lot of religious authority, not just in the West, but across all of Christendom. And in fact, the popes have been bossing around patriarchs in Constantinople and bishops in other cities for many decades. So the Pope is quite well respected and has quite a bit of religious authority. But we are not yet at that stage, as you alluded to, where the papacy has a good bit of sort of secular and temporal power as well. It's really not until the papacy of Gregory the Great in the late 6th and early 7th century that the popes begin to accumulate this sort of temporal authority over the city of Rome and then eventually over what becomes the papal state. So we're at a stage where the popes' aspirations to religious authority really do outstrip their ability to back it up with sort of temporal authority and physical resistance. So the Pope really has nothing to resist Belisarius and Antonina with other than his sort of spiritual reputation. And the fact that there's not really an outcry against his deposition, to me at least, suggests that there might be some grain of truth to this idea that he was a tool of the Ostrogothic regime, because there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of people in Rome that are sad to see him go.
And Antonina, she's not just busy deposing popes. I mean, she seems to be very heavily engaged alongside Belisarius, almost like one of his co-commanders.
Yes, I think this is also extremely unusual, at least as far as we can tell. Antonina is involved in military operations. Now, not to the extent that she is riding into battle at the head of an army. She's not a Joan of Arc sort of female general here leading the troops. But we do know that at one point she works with Belisarius's officers to coordinate a resupply and reinforcement convoy from the coast up the Tiber River into Rome itself. So this is remarkable itself, even if it's not a combat operation, that she is portrayed as having sort of parity with Belisarius's senior officers in making decisions about how to organize and proceed with this resupply convoy. So clearly she is well regarded. And how much of that is due to her own sort of fearsome reputation, and how much of it is due to her status as spouse of Belisarius, I think is up for debate. We can't be sure about that. But either way, she seems to have a reputation, and that reputation gives her authority, and she uses that authority to the hilt.
We've said that Justinian sort of dribbles in reinforcements over time, and a sort of to and fro, and battles are won and lost, and cities are taken, and so on. But eventually Belisarius, he does manage to sort of push up, and I wouldn't go as far as to say he's brought it to a successful conclusion, and maybe you can say a bit more, but he tricks his way into the stronghold of Ravenna. And that's sort of the high watermark, isn't it, for his campaign?
For his campaign and probably for his career overall. 540 turns out to be a very momentous year. So he's managed to receive enough reinforcements to push north. He is outside the gates of Ravenna in the spring of 540. And he wants to take the city because Ravenna is the capital of the Ostrogothic kingdom. It contains the treasury of the Ostrogothic kingdom, and the king, Vitiges, is locked up in Ravenna. So in theory, taking Ravenna, it would sort of lop off the head of the Ostrogothic kingdom and begin the end stages of the war. So he's pursuing a siege of Ravenna, and at this time, Justinian sends diplomats to offer a truce with the kingdom of the Ostrogoths. And the truth is that if you will agree to peace with us, we will allow you to keep half of your treasury and to rule Italy north of the Po River, and we'll have peace. And Belisarius gets this notification, and he absolutely refuses to ratify this peace offer, because he sees it as undercutting all the hard work he and his soldiers have done so far. So Belisarius wants to proceed with the siege of Ravenna and bring about a successful resolution to that siege. And then the Ostrogoths enter the equation with their own proposal, and they suggest that Belisarius could enter the city of Ravenna and could become their emperor, and they would happily serve him as long as they didn't have to serve Justinian. So Belisarius thinks about this and then agrees in principle to the outline of the Ostrogoths' offer. So they open the gates of Ravenna, Belisarius and the Roman army march in, and then over the course of the next few days, Belisarius takes over the treasury, he takes the king into custody, and the Ostrogoths are just waiting around. Well, when's he going to have his big coronation? When's he going to put the crown on his head? When's he going to be our emperor? And eventually they realize that he's not planning to do any of those things. And they come to Belisarius and say, you said you were going to be emperor. And he says, I will never rebel against the emperor Justinian. And the Ostrogoths realize that they've been had, and that Belisarius has, if not outright lied to them, it's not clear the words he uses. He's at least misled them about his intentions. And so Belisarius, at the end of a period of a few weeks, maybe a few months, he packs up the Ostrogothic treasury. He packs up Vitiges, the Ostrogothic king, and he sails back to Constantinople and hands it all over to Justinian. And so at that moment, it seems like Belisarius has achieved his second signal victory, that Italy has been recovered for the emperor. The Ostrogoths still are hanging around in the northern part of Italy, north of the Po River, but it seems like they should be able to be mopped up by other commanders. So it seems that things have gone as Justinian would have wanted them to go.
540, you say that's the high watermark, and I can't remember. I think Milan, before he captured Ravenna, Milan has just been wiped off the face of the map. That's a city maybe even more prosperous, I think, than Rome by this stage. I don't know how many people were living there then, but a very major population center. And then you got the climate is already changing. So, crops aren't growing properly. You've got a plague that comes, I think, starts next year, the following year. In the east, the Ostrogoths have paid off the Persians and said, now would be a great time to invade and take the pressure off us. And they've not just invaded, they've captured the major city in the east, a massive metropolis of Antioch, which they've sacked, taken all the people living there and carted them off back to Mesopotamia. I mean, it's just catastrophe after catastrophe after catastrophe for the Romans, and their empire is just withering about them. What a disaster.
Yes, I think this is all fair to point out. I should clarify that I meant the high water mark of Belisarius's career. Yes, probably not the high water mark of the empire as a whole or of Italy in particular. There are definitely a number of problems from the climate event in 536, which was probably a volcanic eruption or a series of volcanic eruptions, which caused lowered temperatures, less sunlight, and therefore poorer crop yields for a number of years, to the Ostrogoths deciding when they captured Milan back from the Romans in late 538, early 539, to completely wipe the city off the map. It is a horrible destruction with thousands killed and the city literally razed to the ground. And then, as you point out, in 540, the very season that Belisarius captures Ravenna, the Persian king is invading the Roman East at the head of his army and finding the Romans there in disarray. And he manages to push through Mesopotamia and Syria and sack the great city of Antioch, amongst other smaller but still very important cities in the region. So the Roman Empire is in a rough shape. And this is the reason why Belisarius is recalled to Constantinople with his spoils of war. It's also the reason Justinian attempted to forge a peace agreement with the Ostrogoths, because he hoped to finish off the war there so we could focus on the war with Persia. So there are problems brewing, to put it mildly.
Something you said just sort of triggered this in my mind, but you hear Belisarius described as, quotes, the last Roman, unquotes. But you mentioned the capture of Milan by the Ostrogoths, and that just reminded me that time and time again, Belisarius is defied by his own commanders. And I just can't imagine a Roman army of the High Empire or of the Republic. I mean, you hear somebody, the consul's son fights a duel because he when he's been forbidden to leave the ranks, and he's executed. And here, people are just openly defying the senior commander. And I couldn't quite work out, this feels more medieval. I mean, Belisarius has got his own household troops. He's able to almost raise his own private army. This isn't, again, something that you would find in the late Republic or in the High Empire. What's going on here?
We are in an interesting era of Roman history, for sure. Belisarius... So some of this is undoubtedly institutional and structural. The ability to raise household troops, which are officially guardsmen of the individual. So in theory, they should be these small, private guard units. In reality, they can balloon into fairly large numbers, almost like a private army. So that's clearly a structural issue of the period. It's not just Belisarius who does it. Many early medieval Roman generals are doing this kind of thing. But I think there's something personal to Belisarius as well in the way he approaches his relationship with his men. Because you're right, he is openly defied on a number of occasions by subordinate officers, by co-commanders, by his colleagues, even when he has an official grant of authority over all of them from the emperor. And he rarely does much about it. There is one instance in which he has a subordinate commander executed. And this has actually nothing to do with combat, and more to do with this individual refusing to return an item of loot from somebody that he looted it from. But these individuals that defy him in combat operations seem by and large to go unpunished for it. And I wonder if this is more to do with Belisarius' personality than with institutional structures. He seems very interested in collaboration, very interested in working with his officers and including them in discussions. He rarely punishes insubordination. So is this just the way Belisarius operates? Does he just have a hard time envisioning this kind of draconian punishment? Does he want to be liked by everybody? So he's trying his best to not punish people for their bad behavior? It's an open question, I think, about why Belisarius lets some of this behavior get off scot-free.
I wanted to put to you an article I read somewhere. I actually had Ed Watts on the podcast. His thesis was that the Roman Empire in the West didn't really fall in 476. There was still a functioning Roman state at the time the Byzantines arrived with Belisarius. You still got a Senate. You still got the big cities. It's all kind of working. They're trading with Carthage. They're looking to expand into Gaul again. There's still a Roman state there, albeit maybe not what it was. But by the end of the Reconquest, and I guess Justinian sends over Narses, and maybe just talk a little bit about that later, but finishes off over a number of years. By the end of the Byzantine Reconquest, the Senate's gone. There's nothing left. Milan is gone. There's weeds growing up in the Forum. Rome is basically vanished as a major city. It's just a catastrophe. So the Roman state at that point is definitively extinguished. Does that ring bells with you?
Yes, this is a argument that is growing in popularity in modern historiography of the period. And I think it misses a few key points. So we can certainly agree that the prosperity of Italy is rather different in, say, 530 AD and in 560 AD. Something clearly has happened in the intervening period that has absolutely wrecked the prosperity of Italy. So part of that, of course, is the war. But another part of it is this climate event we talked about in 536 that caused reduced crop yields and famine. And part of it, of course, is the plague, starting in about 542 that sweeps through the area and kills an undetermined number of people that historians argue about how much, how few. Some say it was very minimal. Some say it was almost half the population. And this is a very wide variance. I tend to think it was on the higher side, maybe not half, but still a large number of people are killed by this plague. So the disruption of climate, war, and plague certainly combine to really reduce the prosperity of Italy and to wreck the land's economy and the way it's stitched together. But now, if we stretch our minds back here, to say that there is a functioning Roman state in Italy under the Ostrogoths is, I think, a little disingenuous. There is a functioning Roman state, if we want to call it that, ruled by Ostrogoths. This is a kingdom with a stratification in which the Ostrogoths, by and large, have political and military control. There is still a Roman Senate, yes. Some of these Roman senators are still wealthy, yes. They don't have control, well, not that they had control under the emperors, but they are very much living under the boot of Ostrogothic overlords. And we know that at least some Roman senators felt that way and were not terribly keen on the idea. There is a pro-Roman restoration faction within the Ostrogothic kingdom. And another argument that is sometimes made is that this Ostrogothic kingdom existed at the behest and desire of the Roman emperors in Constantinople. And so if that is the case, then in theory, the Roman emperors in Constantinople could revoke that grant of authority to the Ostrogothic rulers and resume their own authority, direct authority over the peninsula. So Justinian clearly thought it was appropriate to claim direct authority over the Italian peninsula and to rule it directly. The Ostrogoths didn't. They had a disagreement about that. And this disagreement resulted in a very destructive war. So I think it's fair to point out that all the sides involved here bear part of the blame for what happened in Italy.
Well, I'm going to bring one more charge against one of your characters, which is Antonina. She's engaged in, I thought really a disgraceful act against a senior Roman politician in Constantinople, and that's the Praetorian prefect, John the Cappadocian. And she basically tells him a pack of lies in order to entrap him into coming out in revolt against Justinian, I think at the behest of Theodora. This is absolutely horrible behavior. I mean, this is the kind of thing you expect from, the court of Nero or Claudius, this sort of scheming. And I just wondered, do you have admiration for her tactical sense, or do you have sort of moral distaste for her actions?
Yeah, I love this anecdote because we have a lot of Belisarius and Antonina acting together. We have relatively little of the things that she accomplished on her own. And this is one of the things that, for better or worse, she owns very directly because she was the only one sort of running this conspiracy. So the way I see it is that we can have a lot of admiration for her political savvy, her acumen, and her skill at subterfuge, while also realizing that what she does is not something that we would think of as admirable. But we have to understand the context here, not to excuse her entrapment scheme. The context is a long-running feud bordering on open warfare between the Praetorian prefect John and the Empress Theodora, who we are told hated each other. We are told that Theodora multiple times tried to get Justinian to fire John, and that John, for his part, multiple times tried to convince Justinian that Theodora was an unfaithful and unloving wife and that he should be rid of her. So these are people that have been engaged in a long-running feud which has very little moral boundaries to it. So by the time Antonina steps in to help out her friend and patroness Theodora, she is stepping into a situation where there is already relatively little boundaries in the way of moral qualms about the tactics that either side is going to use against one another. So in the sense of medieval Roman politics, Antonina is merely playing a hand, which might be played by any powerful Roman courtier looking to achieve an advantage over their rival. And the fact that she plays it so adroitly, in a sense, putting her on the par of this figure who has been the chief civilian minister of Justinian for a decade. This shows her power and her influence in this society. So I think we can appreciate that and admire her pluck, while also sort of deploring the methods that she used. And I don't feel bad for John the Cappadocian. He was a ruthless man who would have done the same had he thought of it. But as I mentioned in the book, Antonina gets to John by befriending his teenage daughter. And this is clearly a young woman that Antonina manipulates and that she convinces that she is her friend and almost a mother-like figure. And then she uses this to bring down
worse and worse
to bring down her beloved father. So I have a lot of sympathy for the daughter Euphemia in this situation, while also realizing that this is an example of Antonina's sort of power within the society.
Do we know what happens to the daughter afterwards?
We do not. No, her father is packed off into exile and forcibly ordained a priest. So presumably he was not around to care for his daughter anymore. We do know that he was allowed some of his wealth and property to sustain him. So presumably this means his daughter was not penniless and wandering the streets, but she is lost to history after this anecdote. So we don't know where she went after that.
It is an interesting sort of insight into power and politics of the time that Justinian, you would think he would execute him. I mean, this is a direct assault on his throne, and yet he chooses not to. And presumably he's balancing, the fact that, if I execute him, somebody else might feel anxious. So let's just keep things calm and remove him as a threat without, provoking anyone else. I thought that was quite surprising. I assume he's not doing it out of kindness. He's presumably doing it out of some kind of political calculation.
Justinian is very restrained in his responses to those that betray him. And I've written about this before. And he is very interested as an emperor in a concept of clemency. For him, forgiveness is a very important feature of a ruler. And he mentions this. We know this is the case because he talks about it in his own laws that he issues. He talks about how he wants to be a clement emperor, and God is merciful to humankind. Therefore, he as emperor will be merciful to his subjects. And we see this play out repeatedly, not just with John the Cappadocian, but with many figures that rebel against Justinian or plot against Justinian, or at least think about plotting against Justinian. They may be removed from their position. They may be disgraced for a time, but the emperor extends forgiveness to them and allows them to return to polite society, and in even many cases returns them to high position. And this is a feature of Justinian's reign, which is quite pronounced. And if you're thinking about a ruthless medieval emperor, quite surprising. But Justinian makes a habit of this kind of clemency throughout his reign.
I hadn't thought of it like that this is just part of his conception of a Christian ruler. I just wanted to, I mean, there's more we could talk about. We could talk about Narses. Actually, I did want to ask a question about Narses. He's Narses the eunuch, and he is sort of the general that finally wraps up the Italian campaign, presumably to Belisarius's disgust. He's given the troops, he's given the army, he's given the means, he's given the money, and he wraps it up with great skill. I think everybody agrees that. But he's Narses the eunuch, and I always associate a eunuch with the Ottoman court, because you need a eunuch when you've got harem to protect, and you don't want anyone with intact, bits and pieces to be guarding your harem. Were eunuchs a thing at the time of the Byzantine Empire, and if so, why?
Yes. So Narses is unusual in that he is a very successful eunuch general, but he's not unusual in that he's a eunuch. So there have been eunuchs at the Eastern Roman court for centuries by the time Narses comes to prominence. And they are used much in the same way. They are used as trusted chamberlains and officials within the palace. So the emperor, being monogamous, has no harem to protect, but he still has a spouse, usually an empress, and sometimes daughters. And in this case, having a eunuch, a not intact male, is useful and sets his mind at ease. And I think more than that, the eunuch is about the safety for political authority as well. So it's not just that you want a eunuch around because the eunuch cannot sleep with your wife. The eunuch is considered widely to be disbarred from imperial power because of his physical state. So having a eunuch close to you to carry out your orders, to be your personal valet, your number one head honcho, they're less likely to want to murder you and take your place because they wouldn't be accepted in that. Right. So that's what Narses is for Justinian. He's a trusted major domo and chamberlain long before he becomes a general. Okay, so shall we get back to the story of Belisarius's campaign?
I think we're now in the year 540, and Belisarius has managed to trick his way into Ravenna. And I think very soon after that, he's recalled to Constantinople. So does Italy remain in Roman hands? Does it all go well for the Romans there? What's happening on the eastern frontier? Because the Persians have sacked Antioch and carried off the population. Take us on from there.
So from 540 onward, the reign of Justinian takes on a much different character. So that the triumphant years of the 530s now have come to an end, and the Romans find themselves locked in a situation which they probably did not want to have happen in the first place, where the war in Italy is not in fact ended, because although Belisarius has captured Ravenna, there are enough Ostrogothic forces that were outside the city that are able to pull together a resistance and keep the war going. So the war is ongoing in Italy, even though Belisarius has been recalled. And Belisarius has been recalled because the Persians have invaded the east, breaking the endless peace they had signed with Justinian in 532. So now there's war in the east as well. So the Romans are fighting this two-front war in Italy and in Mesopotamia and in the Caucasus against the Persians. There is mutiny in North Africa. There are various peoples threatening the security of the Roman Balkans. So Justinian's empire is somewhat hemmed in the 540s. And then we throw on top of that the plague as well. And Belisarius, who should be Justinian's premier general in trying to meet all of these challenges, finds himself disgraced, because when the plague hits in 542 in Constantinople, Justinian falls ill with the disease, his officers begin to whisper, what should happen if the emperor should pass? And somebody, we don't know who, reports to Justinian and to his wife Theodora that Belisarius was engaged in these talks as well. So Belisarius is recalled, he is deposed from office, he is disgraced, and he loses just about everything for a time. So at this moment, when Belisarius is most needed, he is cast down from his position.
And it's quite interesting, though, isn't it, that it's kind of what you were saying before. Justinian, he might put you down, but he very rarely puts you out. It's not like he executes Belisarius. He's still got him sort of on the shelf.
Right, yeah, Belisarius is left on the shelf, almost like being on timeout for those with young children. And after a time, when the emperor decides it's been long enough, he restores Belisarius. He forgives him, he reappoints him, and Belisarius goes on to serve Justinian for another 5 years, a second term, if you will, in Italy as his general, where Belisarius does his best to fight the resurgent Ostrogoths under Totila. And I'm afraid he's not terribly successful in this campaign. He's, in fact, as Procopius reports it, he's barely able to do anything other than land on a few spots on the coast of Italy and sort of sail around the peninsula, looking for a way to make an impact. And this is because he simply does not have enough soldiers with him. Justinian is facing reduced manpower from the ravages of the plague, and he chooses to deploy his soldiers in other theaters, primarily the Eastern Front with Persia. And so Italy is somewhat neglected, and Belisarius is asked to perform miracles with very small numbers of troops, and he's largely unable to do so. He has a few signature moments, but the second campaign in Italy is not as successful as his first campaign.
And is this the one where he tries to relieve the siege of Rome? And he has this sort of very ingenious trick that he's going to burn his way through this sort of barrier that the Ostrogoths have built across the river. And he drops this burning boat on top of one of their towers, and it's fantastically successful. And then yet again, there's this indiscipline in the Roman army where the commander, who's being sort of told, whatever you do, don't leave. I can't remember if it's Portus or Ostia, but he's told, whatever you do, don't leave the city. So he promptly leaves the city and gets captured, which throws all Belisarius's, well-laid plans into complete disarray. And in the end, Rome is captured by the Ostrogoths, right?
Yes, this is one of the dramatic stories of this second campaign, and it involves a double betrayal. So it's this commander from Portus, as you recalled, and also the commander of the garrison in Rome himself fails to sally forth with his soldiers in support of Belisarius's relief operation. So he's sort of double betrayed by his subordinates, and then also on top of that seems to have had a medical emergency of his own. And we're not sure exactly what happened, but I suggest in my book that he suffered a stroke in the midst of this operation. So between his two subordinates failing him and his own medical emergency, Belisarius and his men fall back, and the Ostrogothic siege of the city is not broken. And so the Ostrogoths enter Rome again in 547. It's been 10 years since Belisarius had liberated the city from the Ostrogoths the first time, and now here they are back again.
At that point, the city is effectively depopulated, I think, and there's not much left. I think that's right.
Yes, that's the story we get, is that as Totila takes over the city and then decides it's not worth holding to him, he withdraws with his army and also with whatever civilian population of the city remains. So we're told that for 40 days, Rome remains unoccupied by anybody. Which is hard to believe thinking about it from this distance, but we have multiple sources that say this is the case.
I guess it's fair to say that the Second Italian campaign of Belisarius at least sort of peters out, and he goes back to Constantinople, and the other local Roman forces are left to do, as best they can to cling on to what bits they can, and until Narses, the eunuch, is sent with a decent force to finish the job, right?
Yeah, so we can imagine Belisarius sitting in Constantinople in retirement and getting these reports from Italy about how Narses is having these brilliant victories and defeating Totila and the Ostrogoths because the emperor has finally managed to support the war in Italy with sufficient numbers of soldiers. So we don't have any report of whether Belisarius was frustrated to learn this, but we can well imagine we can imagine he might have been a little frustrated.
Yeah. And so what's the end of Belisarius' story? I read somewhere, maybe it's is it in Procopius? I don't know. There's this story that at some stage the emperor falls out with him, and sort of in a rage he orders that the man be blinded. Is there any truth in that, do we think?
So there's a combination of sources for this story. They're not from Procopius. This is too late from Procopius. But we have,
of course, he's dead by this time, isn't he?
He's either dead or no longer writing. We're not exactly sure when our historian dies. But this is late in the reign of Justinian. This is about 562, and we hear in the chronicler John Malalas that there was a conspiracy arranged against Justinian, and some people in the conspiracy pointed the finger at various officials of the household of Belisarius. So Belisarius is called before the emperor, and charges are read out against him, and the emperor decides that Belisarius is, if not responsible, at least too closely connected for his pleasure. And Belisarius is disgraced yet again. So the initial source, John Malalas, doesn't suggest that there was any blinding that takes place. And he, in fact, informs us that within just less than a year, Belisarius is once again forgiven and restored to favor. But we have a much later source, the Patria Constantinopolitana, dating to probably the 10th century. So we're talking 4 centuries later here. And this source does report that Belisarius was blinded and then went and begged in the streets, and it was this very sorry spectacle of this man who has fallen so far from the top to being blind, homeless, and penniless. And this is most likely a later fiction added to make the story more melodramatic. It seems unlikely that Belisarius was actually blinded at the time. Blinding was not in the 6th century a common punishment for the emperor's rebellious subjects.
So I suppose Belisarius, he can count himself lucky that he didn't live in the reign of somebody like Tiberius, where I guess you didn't get so many second chances.
Right. And we can see this about many periods in Roman history. There's certainly plenty of emperors in the early period and the later Byzantine period who are not so forgiving and are willing to at least mutilate or execute anybody who has even a hint of rebellion to them. So Justinian is an interesting figure in this, capacity for clemency he has.
So I guess that's sort of the end of Belisarius. Does he sort of fade away? And what about Antonina? What's the end of her story? Do we know?
We know Belisarius's death date after his
restoration.
After his restoration to honors and his position in society, Belisarius lives another couple of years and dies peacefully in his bed in 565, really just about 6 months before Justinian himself dies. So it's interesting that these two figures who were so closely connected during their lives happen to die around the same time period. Antonina, I wish I could report a satisfactory ending to her life, but unfortunately she simply disappears from the sources without a trace. The last we hear of Antonina are her activities in the year 549. So presumably she did not die in that year because Procopius might have reported it. So she lives on for some undetermined amount of time. Perhaps she lives just as long as Belisarius and dies in the 560s. I tend to think she died before Belisarius because there's no mention of her receiving anything from his property when he died. So I tend to think she died sooner, but we don't know for sure. And this is one of the difficulties of writing history about figures who are not currently in the public limelight.
Right.
So historians in antiquity, like Procopius, they will write us all sorts of information about people who are engaged in public activities, like fighting wars or negotiating peace treaties or whatever the case may be. But once those people enter into retirement or they're doing things in their private lives, they disappear from those public histories. So we don't have that kind of biographical information for them then. So once Antonina leaves public life because her husband has entered into retirement, then she's no longer sort of worthy of being tracked in these histories of the time period.
And I guess there's no grand tomb of Belisarius or anything of that sort.
No, and in fact, we don't even know where he was buried.
Oh well, I guess all the great careers come to an end sometime, and I guess we're coming to the end of the podcast. I think we're coming to the end now. So, what to say? Look, thank you so much for your time over the last 2 episodes, and I sort of feel, we've talked a lot, but we've barely scratched the surface, and we've had to skip over absolutely masses. And actually some of the most exciting battles and sieges in the book. So there's plenty more for people to get stuck into in the book. And speaking of the book, I just wanted to say I really, really enjoyed it. And I thought it was very clever because it goes along at a terrific pace. So you really, it's kind of narrative history. You're kind of wanting to turn the page to find out, what triumph or calamity is going to occur, but at the same time you're very careful with the sources. I thought that was a very difficult trick to pull off, to make something very readable but at the same time rigorous. The only thing I would say is that you had an absolute gift of a subject, right? Because you've got two such interesting protagonists. You've got Belisarius and Antonina, both of whom are fascinating characters. And as you say in the book, it's unusual we've got so much about such an actively engaged woman from the time, and she absolutely was. So anyway, I thought the book was terrific. And if listeners are at all interested in the period, and they should be, I can't recommend it enough.
You're very kind to say so, and I appreciate your words, and I will take credit only for what I wrote, but I was fortunate in my choice of subjects here because we just happen to know so much about them, and I want to emphasize that as we're closing here. I have many times maybe told you, well, we don't know that, or we don't know this about them, and it's true, there are gaps in our knowledge, but for a non-imperial couple, so somebody who are not emperor and empress, we know probably more about them than just about any
couple of this time period. So we're actually very fortunate to know as much about Belisarius and Antonina, their careers and their relationships as we do. So if there's a pitch to be made for the book, it is that this is a couple about whom we have quite a bit of information, and that makes them interesting as well.
Well, I think that's us. And again, thank you for your patience and for your enthusiasm. And that was terrific. That was great fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me on the podcast.
Well, that's the end of today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, and you have the time, then a review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or wherever it is, that would be fantastic. And generally, if you have any feedback at all, do feel free to drop me a line. My email is hog.russell@gmail.com, and that's 2 G's, 2 S's and 2 L's. Okay, that's it. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll be listening again next time. So, bye for now.